Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 1 of Trouble and Strife, an adventure audio drama series set in the world of Runescape. Episode 1, Cook's Assistant. Teleporting for the first time was an odd experience. I remember being sat down, leaning against my backpack with my legs crossed and reading something out loud to myself, a book. The rest is vague. I can remember my name, Strife, I think, but not much else. Flashes are coming back to me. A feral woman in a clearing throwing a fishing net at me. A furnace pelting me with heat. I suddenly remember an intense fear. A rat jumped up at me only moments ago. Another man was there. I can't picture his face. It's a blurred memory. As the memory faded like dreams, I looked around. I was standing in the courtyard of a medium-sized castle. 2 round fountains flanked the gravel path. One end leading to the castle, the other end a portcullis, and into what looked like, from where I was standing, a small village square. I could hear children playing and the soft, distant hustle and bustle of afternoon trading. It was a warm, still day, and the cool breeze was pleasant. I looked back over to the castle. A gravel path led to a small flight of stone steps lined with well-trimmed, vibrant green shrubs. At the top of the steps were a set of wooden double doors, sturdy and open, flanked on each side by a stone statue, the bust of a man wearing a crown, clearly royalty. The stone walls pierced every few metres by thin arrow windows for archers to fire from, and heraldic shields hanging below them, painted blue with a white chevron pointing up, painted on the bottom half. High above the ramparts, I could see the barrels of cannons overhanging the battlements, seemingly saluted by the rows of flags flying proudly along the wall's edge, painted the same blue and white as the shields. As beautiful as the castle was, all memory had now faded, and I was standing alone and confused. In the distance was a man planting flowers against the outer walls, and over by the steps sat a gentleman wearing a dull red tunic. "Excuse me," I shouted over. Where am I?" The man seemed confused and replied, half-jokingly, "Lumbridge." The name was familiar. It was in the book I was reading, I'm sure of it. "And, how long have I been here?" The man stood up and replied, "Well, let's see." He walked confidently over to me and held out his hand for a handshake. I shook it, and he smiled and introduced himself. "I'm Hans, and you're—" He took a moment to ponder. "You're new here." He released my hand and stood facing me, as if expecting me to make more of this information than I could. "Oh," I said. "Could you tell me why I'm here?" Hans went to open his mouth when the air was filled with a loud, violent scream coming from just inside the castle. I didn't think, I just ran, bounding up the steps and through the doors. Someone was hurt or in serious pain, and I couldn't explain why, but I needed to help. Through the double doors the corridor went left and right, doors on both ends, and paintings of royalty adorning the walls all along. Another scream. It was coming from the left. I took off running, leaving muddy footprints along the thick blue carpet. Bursting through the door at the end of the corridor, I turned right and kept running, small, hanging tapestries billowing out as I ran past them, catching a few with my backpack. A few more paces, and I saw an open door on the right-hand side. Another scream. It was definitely the right room. I took the doorway at such speed I crashed into the frame hard and almost fell into the room, glancing around quickly to take in the situation. It was a kitchen. A white and blue tiled floor, a large wooden table in the centre covered in pots and pans, the mess of complex cooking dripping over the edge onto the floor, eggshells and mounds of flour. Around the room were shelves, sparse and bare. It seemed everything that was once on them was now being used to create a substantial feast. Cuts of meat hanging from metal hooks, a trough under them catching a few drops of errant blood, and over the other side a well-kept range, black cast iron, with a chimney leading to the floor above. The range was covered in pots bubbling and pans sizzling. The smell was a delicious mix of savoury and sweet. And then I saw the cook. A middle-aged man sat on an upturned wooden potato crate, his head in his hands, crumpling his chef's hat against his face. "Are you okay?" I asked. He looked up, wiping his face with his sleeve, his eyes and nose streaming with tears and mucus. His face was that upsetting red that you can only get over crying for something you really care about. "I can't do it," he blubbered through broken breathing. I can't bake the cake. I took a moment and just processed. More of the previous day was coming back to me. I'd caught some fish, I mined some ore. I remember skewering a giant rat through its eye as it clawed at my throat. I remember wanting to be a hero, to save people, to make my mark in history. I ran toward the scream of another because I knew deep down I could help. And as I was running, I remember thinking, will it be a cult abducting the townsfolk? An obsessed stalker come to claim his next victim? Maybe a giant ogre had broken in and was causing havoc? But no. I was prepared for these events. I didn't even realize I was gripping the hilt of my sword, ready to draw and do battle. I was ready for combat. But this I was not ready for. The cook stood up and started picking at the empty eggshells on the table, throwing them into a bin in the corner. I can help you bake a cake, if you like. It wasn't much, but I thought the offer would be a nice gesture. The cook leaned against the table and sighed. I know how to bake a cake, he stuttered through more tears. I looked at the table, and the haphazard piles of flour and egg made me doubt his statement, but it was his kitchen, not mine, so I had no place to argue. So, what's stopping you? I asked. The cook picked up a handful of flour and let it fall sadly through his fingers and back onto the table. It's the Duke's birthday, and I want to make the best cake he's ever had. He took another few sharp, tearful breaths. So I decided to practice making the best cake mix. But now, he gestured around the room, I've used all the ingredients on the practice attempts. Now I can't make any actual cake. He slumped back onto the potato box he'd been wailing from earlier. I wasn't ready for this. I knew I wanted adventure, but I'd always pictured deadly dragons or hidden kingdoms, treachery and betrayal. But here I was, standing in the doorway of a messy kitchen, watching a man cry over cake mix. Maybe this wasn't the journey I had expected, but I was still here, and I could still help. I'm not doing much. I could get you whatever you need for some more cake mix if you like. The cook's head slowly rising, his eyes met mine and his face twisted into a confused smile. Why? Why would you help me? I took a moment to think. Why would I help him? I had no reason to. I didn't know this man and this place wasn't my home, and yet somehow I knew. The answer I give would define me. It would become a guiding principle I'd follow whenever I didn't know what to do. So I smiled back and replied, because I can. His tears seemed to slow, and he took a long, calming breath. If you could fetch me a few eggs, some milk, and some more flour, I'd have enough. Without thinking, I replied, no problem. Then, after a few seconds of actual thinking, I don't know where I am, so I don't actually know how to get any of those things. The cook took a moment and then stood. He swept his arm dramatically across the table, shoving pots and pans to the floor, then dusted the flour away to clear a space in the centre. From the counter on the side, he grabbed a rolled-up canvas and unrolled it flat onto the table. It was a map, simple and crude, with only the very local area detailed, but readable. As I studied it, the cook pointed a finger at the centre. We're here. You'll need to go across the bridge east and then north. Don't worry about the goblins. You'll see a cow field on your right. That's where I get the milk. I nodded along. Bridge, goblins, cows. Then, directly opposite, you'll see a chicken coop. You'll find eggs. And finally, back west across the river, there's a windmill. You can't miss it. Makes the best ground flour in all of Gillinor. Right, I nodded. And what's Gillinor? The confused look returned to the cook's face. Everywhere is Gillinor. Oh, right, I see. The cook stared back at me. Are you sure you're able to help? I rolled up the map from the table and confidently tucked it away into my pack. Absolutely, I lied. Leave it to me. With that, I left the kitchen, walked back down the corridor, turned left, and finally stepped back out the double doors and down the steps. As I walked along the gravel path in the castle courtyard toward the portcullis, I heard Hans shouting over to me. "Never caught your name!" I turned over my shoulder while still walking. "Strife!" I shouted. Hans nodded and went to help the other man planting flowers. Outside the portcullis, the small hamlet was busier than I expected. People dashed back and forth, some carrying baskets of fish, others broken armour or weapons. One gentleman, however, stood out among the rest. He was standing on the riverbank not too far from me, admiring the ducks playfully splashing around. He wore a stunning white set of plate armour, trimmed in dazzling blue. Even from this distance I could tell the craftsmanship was superb, links within links, and small hooks holding the larger carved plates, with inlaid silver veins flowing through it all. His cape, the same glorious white and blue, with flashes of silver when the sun caught it just right. There was no way any living smith could create armour this stunning. As I stood, admiring the beauty of the armour, another gentleman had made his way toward me. He was wearing a light blue overcoat and carrying a staff with an odd curved flourish at the top. "Can I help you with anything?" He seemed eager to help, so I unrolled the map and held it in front of me. He stepped around to my side to see. "Yes, I'm trying to find some milk and egg and some flour, and I need to get here." I pointed to where the cook had marked. "Oh, that's easy," the helpful man exclaimed. "Just hop over this bridge, avoid the goblins, go north, and you'll see a cow field. Then for flour..." I began rolling the map back up while he was talking. "Yeah, the windmill, right, I think I've got this, thank you for your help." I put the map away and made a start toward the wooden bridge that spanned the river. Before I'd taken the first step, the helpful man proclaimed, "Before you go, lad, head over to the church. Never hurts to ask for the gods. A little luck can always help on your journey." I stopped. He was pointing his staff toward a building a short walk away on this side of the river, close to the portcullis. The church was beautiful. Half stone and half glass, each window stained and intricately designed with patterns telling the story of creation, each one topped with the four-pointed star of Saradomin. I wasn't usually a praying man. I'd lived my life without the gods so far, and I'd be fine continuing without them, but not wanting to appear rude to my guide, I turned about and walked inside the church. The church was clean and surprisingly cool. Sunlight streamed in through the windows and parts of the glass roof and covered the floor and pews in a glorious mix of coloured light. You didn't have to be a believer in the gods to appreciate the beautiful artistry involved here. And at the end of the church, toward the largest and most ornate window, a grand organ sat, pipes stretching up into the rafters, and pristine white keys ready to be played. I took it in, the beauty of the church, and as I did, a priest walked calmly over to me. He wore simple grey robes and had a greying ring of thin hair around his head. "I love it when the sun shines, bathes the whole room in colour. I've seen it 1,000 times and never get tired of it." I nodded in agreement. "It's a beautiful sight. The windows are quite something." I gestured toward them. The priest looked around the room. He'd seen them every day for his whole life, and yet he was still in awe of it. It was nice to see someone able to find beauty in that which they knew back to front. It wasn't new to him, but still incredible. The priest looked back toward me and held out his hand for me to shake. "I'm Father Eric." I shook his hand. His grip was firm and friendly. "Strife," I replied. He leaned against the edge of a nearby pew. "So, Strife, what's your plan for the day?" The question seemed earnest, like he genuinely did care. "Well, I got here a few minutes ago, heard a scream, and ran to help. Turns out it was a cook who'd used up all his ingredients, and so I offered to bring some more to him, so I'm off to gather some things." The priest nodded. "Sounds like a kind thing to do." We simply stood. I looked at the coloured light dancing along the walls, and the priest enjoyed the afternoon. It wasn't awkward, as silences often are between strangers. It was calm, oddly connected. Maybe it was the church or the light, maybe simply the kindness of Father Eric himself, but he was pleasant company enough. "Well," I said, "best get going. Never milked a cow before, so that's probably going to take some time to learn." With that, the priest bid me farewell, and I turned and left the church, walking back past the helpful guide. He waved to me, and I waved back, and made my way to the nearby bridge that crossed the small river. As I walked across the bridge, it seemed the grass on the other side writhed and cracked. green plates shifting and merging, and as I neared the end of the bridge I realised it was a mass of goblins, poorly armoured and armed, but many, many more than I'd be able to fight. They shuffled aimlessly about, and other people walking along the same path as me simply ignored them, their hunched green backs carrying pointed-chinned heads, armed, curved and slung low to the floor, each of them wearing ill-fitting brown armour, a mix of cracked leather and whatever chainmail they'd managed to attach to it. One of them looked at me. As our eyes met, I thought about drawing my sword, but instead decided a stern stare was all that I'd need. Surprisingly, it worked, and the goblin slinked away and hid behind a nearby tree. A cowardly creature when alone, it seemed. I carried on down the path, walking to the north in search of the cow field. To my right was a tall metal fence lined with spikes along the top and a patrolling guard on the other side. The guards wore light robes with patches of thin leather armour and carried long, sharp scimitars. Each had wrapped their face in a complete mask of fabric, and in the far distance I could just make out the rolling sand dunes of an expansive desert. To my left, scores of fishermen sat hunched along the riverbank, lazily casting their rods and pulling whatever catches they made in, dropping them into the buckets, ready to eat or sell. I carried on walking north, the soft afternoon sun falling into the trees and bushes along the path, until eventually I heard the unmistakable sound and then smell of a cow field. As I got closer, the smell got stronger. Thankfully, I was no stranger to the smells of the countryside, so I made my way along the path until I found the gate to the field, opened it and walked inside. Several cows were lazily pacing along, grazing as they went, some lying down enjoying the weather. Along the fence further up I could see a few cows separated from the rest, with buckets stacked in a pile next to them, and as I got closer I saw a milkmaid sitting on a three-legged stool, milking. Knowing better than to shout and startle the animal, I stepped into the field and made sure they could see me, and waved to the maid. "Excuse me, a bit of an odd situation, but could you please help me get some milk?" The maid pulled on the cow's udders a few more times until the bucket she was working on was full, then spun round on the stool and beckoned me over. I walked toward her. "Hi, sorry to disturb you. I'm Strife, and I'm hoping, if it's not too much trouble, to have a bucket of milk. It's for the cook in Lumbridge Castle." The milkmaid looked me up and down and took in my odd attire. She looked at my brown corded trousers, simple grey tunic, and falling apart backpack. I had a bronze sword tucked into my belt and a small wooden round shield strapped just below it. My backpack was empty, so drooped low below my hips, and my hair was probably a mess. I knew I didn't look like the adventurer I'd always pictured, but I thought I could absolutely pull off the milk delivery boy look. She beckoned me over and introduced herself. Her name was Gilly Groats. Once I was closer, I asked again. "I know it's odd, but could I please have a bucket of milk?" She scowled. "You can't have one of mine?" She glanced over at the pile of unused buckets. "But you can fill your own." "Deal," I replied, and took a bucket from the pile. There was another empty three-legged stool in front of another cow, so I sat down, placed the bucket under the cow, then looked back at Gilly. How do I do this? Do I just grab and pull?" She rolled her eyes and returned to milking. It didn't look too difficult, so with confidence I reached forward, grabbed an udder, and pulled down hard. The cow jolted forward, reeled its back leg up, and then kicked firmly back. The hoof caught me square in the shoulder and sent me flying back. The stool I was sitting on kicked into the air, and the bucket I was trying to fill fell, spilled what little milk it had, and rolled away. I came down with a hard crash a few feet behind where Gilly was sitting. My backpack softened my landing somewhat, but my shoulder throbbed and pulsed with pain. Gilly sighed, stood up, and walked over to the stool and bucket I'd been using, placing them back where they should be, and then returned to her milking. I lay on the floor, staring up at the sky. My shoulder felt twice as big as my body, and the shock of the impact feeding me so much adrenaline, I wasn't able to fully understand how much my arm hurt. Unfortunately, after a few seconds, the shock faded and the intense pressure morphed into extreme pain. I clawed my way onto my knees, and then stood, one leg, then the other, my backpack hanging off one shoulder as the other was now too sensitive to move. I hobbled over to Gilly and tried to talk through the pain. "Could you please help me? I'm not really sure how to do this." Gilly abruptly stopped milking and turned sharply to face me. She looked at my drooping arm and pain-racked face. Then pity seemed to overtake her. She reached under her own cow and handed me the bucket she'd been filling. As I took it, she spoke. "Just because you offer to help someone doesn't mean you're able to." Her words cut deep. I'd wanted to help so badly I never stopped to think if I actually could. Maybe fighting a dragon or saving the world would have to wait. If I wasn't able to best a cow, I'd probably struggle against, well, anything. I reached out my arm to take the bucket, but as I clasped my fingers around the handle, my backpack slipped from my shoulder and fell into the crux of my elbow. The impact jerked my hand down, and I spilled a large amount of warm milk over Gilly. "Sorry," I gasped. Gilly gritted her teeth, grabbed another bucket, and returned to milking. I hobbled feebly out of the cow field with half a bucket of milk, embarrassment, and a shoulder bruised and painful. One item down, and I was hurting and embarrassed. I had foolishly assumed this would be simpler, but I carefully carried the bucket of milk across the path and found the nearby chicken coop. It was a small farm building with a lean-to shed attached to the side, and inside that several chickens roosting on comfortable nests. The farmer was sweeping hay from the floor with a broom made from twigs and twine. He looked up and saw me. An interesting sight, I'm sure. A bucket of milk in one arm, my other arm drooping down by my side, and a tatty backpack flapping against my back. The blade of my bronze sword had mud clinging to it from where it had been kicked into the dirt, and I think the arm grip on my shield was broken. He stopped sweeping and leaned forward on his broom, bending the bristles. "Can I help you?" I looked toward the chickens. The cook from Lumbridge has sent me to find an egg." The farmer placed a long piece of hay into his mouth and nonchalantly chewed on it. "Just the one egg?" I shrugged. "I think so." The farmer smiled. "Go on then." And with that, he scooped an egg from the floor nearby and tossed it toward me, clearly expecting me to catch it with my free hand. "No, don't! I can't move my—" The egg cracked across my face, yolk dripping down my nose and over my chin. I spat out a small piece of shell, and the farmer simply stared at me. "Probably a bit useful, lad," he said, "if you learn to catch things." I stood and waited for the larger chunk of yolk to drip from my face onto the floor. "I'll remember that, thanks." The farmer nodded his head toward another egg on the floor, then rolled it gently toward me with his foot, then returned to his sweeping. I kneeled down and picked up the egg, carefully tucking it away in a side pocket of my pack, left the chicken coop and reread the map. The mill should be due west of where I was, and lifting my head, I could indeed see the 4 large blades slicing gracefully through the sky in the distance. However, it was on the other side of the river, so I walked back south, making very sure not to spill any more milk or crack the egg, crossed the bridge back, and then made my way north following the well-worn gravel path toward the mill. Other people were passing me by, staring, side-eyes as I walked. I couldn't blame them. I'd stare at a limping man covered in egg too. Eventually I made my way to the mill, round a corner and down more path. I saw the entrance. It was surrounded by glorious wheat fields, golden strands wafting in the breeze. I figured I'd need some to make the flour, so I reached over the fence and grabbed a handful, pulling them firmly from the ground, then made my way toward the front door of the great mill. Inside was a metal chute in the centre of the room, and through it came soft wisps of flour, landing in a wooden flour bin below. The edges of the room lined with sacks and pots, empty crates and various farm tools. I could see a steep set of steps leading to the upper floors, too steep to climb with anything awkward, so I placed the bucket of milk and my pack down on a wooden crate, and holding my handful of wheat, climbed the steps. I remember reading about how mills worked in school. Wind drove the blades, which turned a huge grindstone. Wheat dropped in the top, flour came out the bottom. At the top of these steep stairs I emerged into the middle floor, the round, heavy disc spinning with quite some speed. The wooden floor I was walking on had holes and gaps between the boards which let me see down to the floor below. Over the other side, more steps led higher, so I carefully walked around the room, avoiding the grindstone as it spun, and climbed higher. On the top floor, the building narrowed to a point in the roof above me, and the great blades spun, attached to a thick wooden beam that twisted above my head. Gears and cogs connected, and the huge pillar in the centre of the room spun downwards, driving the stone below. I could see some old dry boxes and nets, a few broken tools scattered around, and in the centre, just offset from the pillar, a wooden chute, the hopper. I dropped my handful of wheat inside, then leaned over and peered down. The wheat was caught on some sort of door. It hadn't dropped onto the grindstone below. Next to the hopper were several levers. I figured it couldn't hurt, so I grabbed one and pulled it firmly toward me. The little door opened and the wheat fell through onto the stone. Perfect. I climbed back down the steps carefully to the middle floor, but then I happened to catch a glimpse of something through the gaps in the floor. Something green. A goblin on the ground floor had wandered into the mill. It was rummaging around. Then it laid its hands on my pack and bucket of milk. I shouted down, "Oi, get off those!" The goblin looked up. I knew that face. It was the one from earlier, the one I'd stared down. It smirked at me through the gaps in the floor, then grabbed my pack and bucket in its grubby hands and ran out of the mill. "No, don't you dare! You get back here!" I shouted and ran around the spinning stone to the steps leading down. I reached out my hand to grab the banner and slide down quickly, forgetting my arm was still weak from the cow kick. I couldn't grasp it in time and, misjudging my abilities, I slipped, fell and tumbled down the steps, hitting several on the way down before landing painfully hard on the floor below. Hitting the floor, flour plumed into the air and stuck to the egg that was still drying on my face, some mixed with the sweat in my hair, most just covering my clothes in a thin layer of white. I didn't have time to hurt, so I dragged myself up with my good arm and looked around for something to carry my flour in. It was softly making its way down the metal chute and settling in the flour bin. I grabbed a close-by pot, scooped what flour I'd managed to make into it, and ran out the door, back down the path and back across the bridge. I had no idea where the goblin had gone. My only idea was to return to where I'd seen it before. Quickly jogging back down the path and toward the small goblin horde, I drew a few curious glances from the fishermen on the riverbank and the guards patrolling the spiked fence, but I didn't care. I could see the goblin. It was triumphantly holding aloft my pack, and two other goblins were gleefully jumping around as he shook my belongings onto the floor. The map tumbled out and unrolled. Thankfully, the egg stayed in the side pocket. As I walked closer, the goblin saw me and bared its teeth. Surrounded by its friends and with something to boast about, it had found a new confidence. I was angry. I was in a strange place, surrounded by strange people. I'd been kicked by a cow in my shoulder, I had egg on my face, the front of me was covered in flour, and now I'd been robbed by a goblin. I had absolutely no time for talking or playing. I strode directly toward my pack, and as I did, the goblin hissed a defiant hiss and charged toward me. If I had been calmer, I may have drawn my sword or stepped back into a fighting stance, maybe taken in the area around me and planned an attack, but I responded in kind. Dropping the pot of flour to the floor, I screamed and broke into a sprint. The goblin's friends were cheering it on in a vile, guttural way as he feebly attempted to jump at my face. I pulled my hand back, clenched my fist tight and yelled as I ran full speed at the green devil and drove my fist hard onto its scaly face. I felt a crack, either its nose or my knuckles, I didn't know, and then the warm coating of blood over my fist. The punch was so hard it knocked the goblin out the air and backwards onto the floor. It screamed and struggled to get up, but I was on top of it in an instant. I dropped my knee onto its throat to pin it down and raised my fist again, bringing it down hard and firm where the goblin's nose used to be, again and again and again. I only stopped when I realised I was punching the dirt below. Its face so caved through, my knuckles were drawing up clumps of blood-soaked grass with every swing. I was panting. I'd never been that angry. I don't know what happened. And as I looked up and around, the goblins had stopped and were watching. I was kneeling over one of them, pinning him to the floor with my leg, and had punched my way through its skull. The two playing with my pack had dropped it and were backing away slowly. I stood and walked over, rolling the map back up and putting it away. The egg was safe, and the milk, while slightly spilled, was mostly still there. I picked up the pot of flour from where I'd left it and made my way back across the bridge, through the portcullis and across the castle courtyard. As I walked, Hans saw me and shouted over, Are you okay, Strife?" I looked back, face covered in flour and dried egg, clothes splattered with mud and goblin blood, my hand red raw with clumps of bloody grass and skull. I'm fine. Hans gave me a thumbs up and returned to pacing around. I walked inside the castle, down the corridors, and finally back into the kitchen. It was tidier than before. The pots were mostly washed, and the cook was kneeling down, scrubbing the mess off the floor with a stiff brush. When he heard me walk in, he stood up and looked over. "Ah, Strife, you're... What on Gillinor happened to you?" I approached the table and placed my things down on it. "Milk, egg, flour," I said as I put the items down in front of him. He took it in, then returned to looking at me. "What happened? You've only been gone 10 minutes." I stared straight through him. "Cows happened, then a farmer, then goblins." "I see," replied the cook, unable to hide his confusion. "Anyway, here's all the stuff you need. Now you can make a cake." The cook smiled. "I can indeed." He took the ingredients and placed them on the work surface around the room, then turned back to me. "Say, Strife, if you want, I can teach you how. I mean, I've figured out the best recipe. Wouldn't mind sharing it with you for all the trouble you've gone to." I thought about it, and then looked back at the cook and said, Yeah, I'd like that." Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the adventure. If you have any feedback, then leave a comment below or come chat to me live on Twitch, Twitter or Discord. Links in the description below. Thanks for your time and have a great day.